As well, you can have during this period some development of Brettanomyces anomala. So this yeast is not wanted in French cider because it's going to destroy the fruity aroma. When the aroma is destroyed, it's going to generate some other aroma that you don't want.
Hello, my name is Ria Windcaller, and I am the producer and cider MC of this weekly podcast, where we speak with makers, cider enthusiasts, and folks within the cider trade from around the world.
Hip, hip, hooray!
Bringing us into this here episode 372 of Cider Chat, you are hearing from Hugues Guichard talking about something known as Brettanomyces, or a lot of folks refer to it as Brett for short. I first was really acquainted with it as a home brewer making beer, and I'd get a little bit of Brett on the back nose. In fact, there's even like you could add it to a ferment. You're essentially inoculating the beverage with Brettanomyces because it is a yeast, or what folks might refer to as a culture. Those are interchangeable words. And though it could be naturally occurring, you can get a Brettanomyces culture to add to a ferment. And sometimes, it's just delightful to have a little bit of Brett on the nose. But we're going to discover that for French cider makers, they do not want to have that on the nose because it masks the aroma. And I'm down with that. And that's what we're going to be hearing all about. That's just like one little speck of what you're going to be hearing about on this featured presentation this week on Cider Chat. It's the science behind spontaneous fermentation. And believe me, you're going to have a lot to talk about at your next cider cocktail with your fellow cider makers or your fellow cider aficionados, all on spontaneous fermentation. I mean, this is going to up-level your game a lot. Hugues Guichard is based in Normandy, and he's part of an institute that is all about research for cider. And this lecture is from CiderCon 2023. He was asked to come there and to speak on this topic. And yeah, I can't say enough about it. I just learned so much. And you could go to the show notes for Cider Chat, and you will see the key yeast and bacteria that he's talking about here, because they're kind of tongue twisters in the way that they can be, like Brettanomyces forever. When I first heard it, I was like, what are you saying? I just call it Brett for short because I couldn't pronounce it. That is just one of many that he discusses. So I'll talk a little bit more when we go to that featured presentation. But meanwhile, I have a wee bit of news from out and about in Ciderville. On the last episode of Cider Chat, which was all on mechanical harvesting, I really recommend you check that out, especially if you are a commercial orchardist or cider maker, or someone like myself who's just a total apple nerd in training and wants to know everything there is about it because, well, it's a cool world to be part of. I discussed the upcoming New York Apple Camp, and that's going to be taking place July 28th, 29th, and 30th of this year. So this episode's going live in June, which means that the days are counting down. We're like a month out to New York Apple Camp. Tickets are live, and they are selling. And I want to make a little note here. They are selling, and there's not even a speaker list up yet. By the time this episode goes live, I'm told that there's going to be a tentative speaker list, and you could be able to check that out. But talk about trust. That tells me a little bit on how important this topic is. It's a topic, about growing apples, climate change, best practices, but it's also a coming together of community, all centered around quality of life and good practices for orchard care, and also cider. So it's going to be cider tastings and a bit of a, hootenanny type of thing too. It's going to be taking place at the Ashokan Center in Hudson Valley. This is being sponsored. This entire camp is being sponsored and bankrolled right now by the Hudson Valley Farmhouse Cider. And so they're counting on folks showing up. So I'm getting the word out, helping them as best I can. Please, if you hear this and if you know somebody who would benefit from going to Apple Camp, whether they be commercial or non-commercial, because there'll be topics for home orchardists. Let's say you have like 4 apple trees, like how to deal with that. What to plant, or you bought some property with an apple tree there and you think, oh my gosh, I have like a 200-year-old apple tree. You might find out maybe it's only 40 years old. Either way, what do you do with a young tree or an old tree that's been neglected and wants a little bit of tender loving care? There are some best practices for that. So that's what you're going to be able to get at New York Apple Camp. You can go to HV Center for Food, Art, and ag.org. Maybe just try Googling New York Apple Camp. Hopefully it'll come up. But either way, we got you covered here at ciderchat.com. You'll find a link in the show notes. Hope to see you there. Once again, July 28th, 29th, and 30th at the Ashokan Center, which is a glorious historical center right smack in the Hudson Valley of New York.
Walking through the orchards.
There are a lot of competitions taking place for cider all over the world right now. And one that kind of caught my attention is going to be taking place in an area of the world that a lot of people don't know about, and that's Eastern Europe. And I don't know a lot about this particular competition. I've never been invited, but as a side note, it's called the Nordic International Cider Awards, and I guess the competition takes place September 8th through the 9th, and you could send in your ciders now. You have till August 1st to do that, and I saw our friend Tom Oliver talking about it. He did a little public announcement saying that he's going to be there, and if Tom's going, that's going to be fun. But the key thing for me was this is a region of the world that you don't hear a lot about, but there is a lot of apple growing. And so it's going to be taking place, this competition, in the capital of Latvia, which is Riga. And Latvia is Eastern Europe. So you have Latvia. Right below Latvia is the country of Lithuania. Below Lithuania is Poland. All apple growing areas. To the east of Latvia and Lithuania is Belarus, and to the east of that country is Russia. So that'll just give you a little perspective of what's going on. One thing I know about the folks from the Baltic region, me being one of them, is that we love good food and good libations. So it should be a ton of fun hanging out with all the Latvians in Riga. And if you get down to Lithuania, you will not be disappointed. But anyways, Riga's going to probably give you a whole bunch of stuff to do there. I'm going to have a link in the show notes to this particular competition. So if you're looking to send some cider to a different area of the world and kind of pull in or even go and visit, this might be a good opportunity to do that. The fall is a beautiful time to be there. Again, that is the Nordic International Cider Awards. Get in your ciders by August 1st. Up next is our featured presentation pre-recorded at CiderCon 2023 titled The Science Behind Spontaneous Fermentation. You'll first hear from Eleanor Leger, who is currently the president of the American Cider Association, and she will be introducing Hugues to the audience. And then you will hear from Hugues Guichard, who is the featured speaker. He works at an institute in France, which is all about studying cider making, and it's supported by the French government. So they already are like one step ahead of a lot of us here in other parts of the world. And he's going to go through the steps of making cider, from the harvest of the fruit to fermentation, maturation, clarification, bottling, and has some conclusion. It is an in-depth presentation, but I found it, it's something that I could kind of like listen to over and over again. And each time I get more and more out of this presentation. He's going to be talking about it from the French perspective, but boy, there's a lot to glean out of this. I do want to say that he is a Frenchman, and so he has impeccable English, and it will require you as a listener to kind of just relax and listen to him and get used to his tonality so you could follow along. If you go to the show notes at ciderchat.com for episode 372, you will see that I have written out there the key yeast that he's discussing, and they are tongue twisters, so that might help you kind of follow along. There is going to be a companion video to this episode going live at the Cider Chat YouTube channel. It will first go live for patrons of Cider Chat. Then in about a week or two, it will go live for the public, and you can follow along. And that's just going to be primarily the presentation synced with the slides show. So you'll get all the detail that he's going into. And both the podcast and that video are really worth delving into if this is a topic of interest for you. And of course, you too can become a patron today. Just go to the Cider Chat Patreon page and join, and you'll get an early release of that video presentation. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Eleanor Luget, who will bring us into the intro to Hugues and this presentation overall. And that means it's a very good time to grab a glass and join this chat, pre-recorded at CiderCon 2023 in Chicago, hosted by the American Cider Association, and featuring Hugues Guichard.
Spontaneous fermentation is something that has been growing more and more popular among cider makers in the U.S. Those of us who started making cider a while ago all sort of got into it because we took Peter Mitchell's course where we learned to avoid lots of the things that can happen with spontaneous fermentation. And yet there's so many interesting nuances and characteristics and truth about fruit that can be expressed in a cider that has been spontaneously fermented. There's, of course, in the U.S., everybody can do whatever they want. And a lot of the folks who've been pushing spontaneous fermentation have come at it from a point of view of, very earthy and artistic, and I'm going to express the fruit and all of this, versus the sort of very scientific, pitch a yeast, do this, measure that. But the fact is, of course, there is science going on in the glass, right? And just as in any other aspect of cider making, when the choices that you make, whether it's the type of fruit and its characteristics and the temperature you're in and the vessel that you use and the length of time that you let things do things, will all impact the outcome. And you can sort of figure things out trial by error, although I'm still doing that after 15 years and it still doesn't work. Or we can learn a little bit more about the science that can help us understand when we make those decisions, what is the more likely outcome going to be. And that was sort of my thinking behind having this session. Finding somebody who has the real scientific data and experience around spontaneous fermentation in this country is super hard. So we have gone to France because French cider is all historically all spontaneously fermented, and they wonderfully support their cider industry, the government, with research and expert people, and they have them. And so we're very excited to have Hugues here today from the, am I going to get this right, Institut de Productions Cidricoles. Is that correct? Okay. The one thing, for those of you who don't know French ciders well, is they are typically made in a way that leaves residual sweetness. Many of the folks doing spontaneous fermentation in this country are letting them go all the way to dry. And so when I was speaking with Hugues in advance, I asked him to think about, in addition to talking about how the French do spontaneous fermentation, thinking about what some of the implications might be if you're aiming for something dry and not residual sweetness. There may be things that they do in France that you don't need to do or may do differently. So I ask you to have an open mind and give him the benefit of the doubt that he's coming from what in France is a very strict tradition that is government regulated. You have to produce cider in Normandy in a certain way to get the Normandy mark on it. You don't have patience and generosity. And also just remember he's speaking in his second language, which I know a few words of French, and it's so hard to speak French, and he's doing it all in English. So without further ado, please welcome Hugues. in the vein of, we're going to also maybe talk a little bit about dry things. In your glass right now, you have not a French cider. You have a Wixon single variety, spontaneously fermented natural cider from Elizabeth Ryan, Stone Ridge Orchards, Hudson Valley Farmhouse Ciders. Wixon, is wonderful high acid apple. So this is great, wonderful, racy acidity, beautiful expression of the lemon that comes through in that fruit, and something for you to sip on. And then we will get to two wonderful French ciders that Hugues has brought.
Thank you very much of being so many people here to hear my presentation. I'm gonna try to be as clear as possible. So excuse my English or my French. And thanks for the sponsor for today. And so I'm gonna start with the science behind spontaneous fermentation. All the work I will present you is made in the French Institute for cider production. We are located in the far west in France, Bretagne and Normandy. My presentation will go through a quick presentation of the French industry, our institute, and then I will go through the process of cider making in France, so with the different steps, and I will try to explain you what you have to control during all those steps, and a quick conclusion on the key points you have to remind. The main production of specific apple fruits are made in the far west, like I said, so that's a big circle. It's Bretagne and Normandy, but there is some other regions where we can make some cider. 90% of the production is in Northwest. We have two different orchards. So one is typical meadow orchard, that's tall trees. That's something typical in France. We'd like to have this image of cows or some other animals under the trees. And there is a more intensified orchard made in the 80s. And it provides the biggest production in France. Some statistics. So it's about 250,000 tons a year. And most of the apples are processed in cider. But we are making more and more apple juice. And there is a part who goes for the spirits, the vinegar, and some other product. So it's about, for the cider, it's about 1 million hectoliters per year. 80% of the production is made and processed by two big companies. So it's a little bit different from your America. And 20%, the last 20% are made by craft cidery, so smaller size cidery. There is a definition of the cider in France, and we have to have a lot of fresh apple juice. The concentrates are very limited in France, so we try more and more to work with a pure juice, apple juice. We have a structure of the cider industry, a specific organization, Cider de France, that the interprofessional association, the National French Cider Association, regroups all the apple grower and the apple transformers. You can see on the top. And each people have a tax, something like a tax, a compulsory, a voluntary contribution that helps to make a collective promotion of the cider, so for all the cider industry, but also the technical action, the collective research. And that's the part we are going to talk today, that the IFPC way we finance this institution. We are a very small company, in fact. We have 12 people, permanent people. And we are hiring some people to help us on some different tasks. That's the reason why I put 15 employees, including 12 permanent people. And it's about 1.5 million euros budget a year. The French Institute, two different locations in France. So one in Normandy, based in C. That's a very small city in France, which is dedicated for the orcharding research. And we have a specific orchard where we make experiments. And there is a second location where I'm working, located in Rennes, and it's in Brittany. And we have all the equipment to work on the transformation from the apple to the product, cider, juice, and so on. So the apple production is kind of specific in France, that the part is making in Normandy. They're working on the creation of new varieties because we're looking for different characters of the apple due to the climate changes. We try to optimize the production techniques and so on. For the cider making, we're working on the optimization of the processing. We are working on the yeast, on bacteria, to control a little bit more the fermentation. That's what we're going to talk today. And also different other characteristics, the color, the bitterness, all the savors. And we try to optimize the aromatic expression in cider. We are working on the hygienes, all the cleaning techniques you have to really put in your cidery to have a clean product. So the processing. First of all, I wanted to talk about the apples and the harvest because it's specific in France. We have plenty of different varieties of apples that we can use in France. So it's classified by the total polyphenolic content and with the acidity. We can have some varieties like Marie Ménard.
He's talking about the apple called Marie Menard.
Some of you knows the varieties already, but which is very, very rich in polyphenols. And another way, we have some other varieties that are very sharp, very acidic, like the Evrol. And you can see that we have plenty of different variety that we can put here. And that's all those varieties that we are using to make the balance in the taste of the cider, the French cider. All the French apples, cider apples, should have a polyphenol content over 1 grams per liter in the must. So that's pretty important. Compared to the apple fruit, the eating apple, we have smaller fruits. Usually we have fruit around 45 to 90 grams per apple. We have selected a lot of different varieties. They are rustic varieties, meaning that they have a high polyphenol content and they are very resistant concerning the disease we can have in the orchard. There is no constraint of the appearance, so we have less product that we can put in the orchard. There is less insecticides and stuff like this. We needed to have a cost reduction in the production of fruit. So now we harvest. The harvest is almost done by mechanization. So that's a problem for the fruits because it can be hurt when you harvest it. It can be hurt by the machine that harvests the apple on the floor because we are waiting for the dropping of the fruit on the floor to be harvested. That's something a little bit specific, and we need to have a process very rapidly after that. So we're waiting for the natural fall of the fruit, which is about, well, depending the variety, is between September and December. But the main variety is falling around October, so there is a big moment where we have to work a lot. What we recommend to the producer is to be very rapid to process the fruit after the mechanical harvest. And normally, we shouldn't wait 3 days after the mechanical harvest to have a good processing quality of the fruit. Otherwise, we can have more and more possible contamination by spoiling microorganisms, and I will talk about that a little later. After we harvest the fruit, we have to carry the fruit to the processing machine. The carrying is made with water. That's a recycled water. During this step, we can have a possible cross-contamination by spoiling microorganisms. So that's a key point to be really aware, and we should be careful about that because the microorganism can grow really rapidly in this water, and more with the climate changes, we saw that the increase of temperature is going to improve this development of microorganisms. So we have to be careful about acetic acid bacteria, Brettanomyces, and so on. That's really a big concern at this point. So I will go rapidly through this slides, because that's just the composition of a must we have. So that just to show you the range of concentration we can have in the different elements: sugar, acid, polyphenols, the nitrogen component. You can see it's a wide composition, but the average of nitrogen, the YAN, is about 70 to 80 milligram per liters. That's not a lot compared probably to the eating apple. And that's due to the fact that the orchard are not a lot treated with nitrogen, additional nitrogen. So we have a low nitrogen level, but it's very important in our context for the development of the aroma. And I will probably talk a little bit about that later. We are talking about the must. After we made the must, there is another step, the clarification. So there is different way for the clarification. For some products, for instance, the brandies, we don't have any clarification. Usually, we put the must in a kettle, and then the fermentation go on alone rapidly without any control. We can have a settling that's mostly used for the sour and sharp varieties, because the kiving that I will talk later is not possible or very, very difficult to get on the sour and sharp variety due to the pH. When it's too low, the kiving is not working. And then the hydrolysis of the pectin is done to remove the pectin, and there is a setting of the pectin in the bottom of the kettle. And the other one, which is the more used in France, and due to the characteristic of the apples, we can do the kiving, so the clarification by a gelling of the pectin and a racking. So the pectin is there is a demethylation of the pectin by an enzyme activity, and there is a gelling which is formed with a calcium addition, and this gel will separate and will go to the top of the kettle, what we call chapeau brun. Brown hat in English. When the brown hat is made, we have to transfer the clear must in another kettle, another vat, to keep the clear must. That's the clear must that's gonna be fermented. That's a little experiment we made to show what is important in clarification. You can see it starting. So at the left, you have the control. In the middle, where you go, you see the fermentation very active. This is the same must, but with addition of Saccharomyces uvarum. And on the other step, that the same must, but with the addition of Enseniaspora valbensis, which is another yeast that we found in French cider. The importance of this yeast, this particular yeast, the Enseniaspora valbensis, because we need to have a gentle start of the fermentation to be successful in this clarification. When you see the three fermenters in the middle with Saccharomyces uvarum, the fermentation is so active, so rapid, that the brown hat is completely broken, and then the clarification could not be made at this moment. So we showed that there is an important yeast in French cider, but this yeast is very sensible to sulfite. So if you put sulfite in the must at the beginning of the fermentation, you will remove this specific yeast. The clarification will be pretty difficult to obtain. Another parameter is the low temperature. You have to have a low temperature to be succeed in this step. Well, usually in October in France, the temperature were quite low, about 10 degrees C. But with the changes of the climate, it's more and more difficult to have to keep this temperature. So that's a real concern with the changes that we are observing actually. So most people have now their cidery with regulation of the temperature to help all the process. I said we have a clear must, and now go to the fermentation step. We have different microorganisms that can help the fermentation. I talked about two of them just before. So in spontaneous fermentation, you have Metschnikova pulcherrima, which is a yeast that you can find on the apple, that's naturally present on the apple. It can have a small effect on aroma at the beginning of the fermentation, but as soon as you have a lack of oxygen, this yeast will gonna die. The second one, I talked about it earlier, Ensenia valbiensis. This apple grows as well on apple, but we can find it in the must. And it's very important for the clarification, but for the aroma as well. It has a very important esterification capacity that makes some aroma with fruity notes and so on. So this yeast will last for 1 to 2 weeks depending on the conditions, and then it will decrease in the must afterwards. Then you have the Saccharomyces suvarum, the third important yeast that's gonna make the fermentation. So it's different from the Saccharomyces you can find you can buy and you can find in wine. In wine, you have Saccharomyces cerevisiae, and the condition of growth is completely different for Uvarum. Uvarum is naturally selected in the cider, in French cider, due to the temperature. I said that usually the temperature was around 10 degrees, and this yeast is able to grow quite easily at this temperature. So rapidly, this yeast become dominant and then conduct the fermentation. I wanted to talk rapidly about the main risk we have related to possible off-flavor formation in cider. There's the volatile acidity that is due to acidic acid bacteria. So, like the name of the bacteria, they're gonna generate acidic acids and ethyl acetate, which gave this specific aroma with this bacteria, which is not really wanted in cider. In French legislation, we have a limit level that we shouldn't go over. It's 1 gram equivalent sulfuric acid per liter. Another disease, the French sickness, why we call in French framboisé, is due to a specific bacteria, Ximomonas mobilis, which is going to generate a lot of ethanol. And this compound have somewhere a specific aroma, a strawberry aroma, and red fruit aroma, and we call that framboisé. So, but there is a lot of other unpleasant flavors that can be developed by these bacteria, so we really don't want it. And most of it, in bottle, you can have a very, very high pressure. Due to the consumption of sugar, this bacteria is able to remove a lot of sugar and to generate a lot of carbonic gas, which means that the pressure will be very, very high. We can see a bottle explosion, so it's very dangerous. The two other main defects that we can have in cider is the lactic acid spoilage due to a specific. So that's the new name of this bacteria, Segondi lactobacillus collinoides. It was previously called Lactobacillus collinoides. Well, that's a new name that came this year. And this bacteria will be able to transform the malic acids in lactate and also in acetic acid. And this can be a problem for the aroma of the product. And the last one, something you probably know in In the States, the phenolic of flavor, which is due to Brettanomyces. Brettanomyces anomala, its specificity of the cider is different from the Brettanomyces from wine. And this specific yeast, it's a yeast, it's not a bacteria, this specific yeast will generate volatile phenols that gave, well, the two main phenols are ethyl phenol and ethyl catechol, that are going to give some animal flavor like leather. I will show you that a little bit later. So I will show you the different way the fermentation evolved in the French cider. So first of all, the primary reaction, like I said before, is something we call oxidative fermentation. It's not a very appropriate name, but that's a name we gave, which is due to the Enseniaspora valbiensis, apiculate yeast. Though this is a very short period. I said 1 to 2 weeks. The yeast lasts for 1 to 2 weeks. And it's able to generate some very interesting flavors like floral aroma or fruity aroma, depending the compound which are going to be made. Then afterwards, the main fermentation is starting. So the yeast, Saccharomyces uvarum, is going to take place. I added the Saccharomyces cerevisiae because due to the climate changes, sometimes in some cidery we can find some cerevisiae. Like I told you, probably that the cerevisiae is present in the cider, but due to the temperature we have, normally the uvarum will be selected naturally in the cider. Due to these climate changes and the high temperature we can have during the October or November period, sometimes we have cerevisiae which is developing. Well, uvarum is able as well to give some very interesting aroma. You can see pear, banana, fruity flavors. That's usually what happens in the natural spontaneous fermentation. Another point is that very interesting during the fermentation, you will have the formation of CO2 that will protect the product from the oxygen incoming. We don't want to have oxygen during the fermentation. It's better to keep the oxygen away from the fermentation process, to keep the quality of the product. So, like it was said before, one of the goals in the French cider fermentation is to keep the product sweet, and all year long. We want to have this type of product all year long. So, the fermentation is not total. We still have sugar. And it's a long fermentation. Probably that's something different from the type of fermentation you have in America. The fermentation lasts for something like 2 to 6 months. To 6 months. It's very, very long, and we try to keep this speed of fermentation with low temperature. So the moderate speed is due as well to a low level of population, Saccharomyces uvarum. Because, like I said before, there is not a lot of yan in the French apple. So if you don't have a lot of yan, the population of the yeast will be quite smaller.
Yan is short for yeast assimilable nitrogen.
A lot smaller even. We never go over 10 to 7 UFC per milliliters. There is one way to conduct the fermentation to slow it down is to get some biomass reduction. So we try to have a depletion in yan by getting out the part of the yeast. So in this case, as we have less population, we're going to slow down the speed of the fermentation. The goal is to remove the yan from the cider. We don't want to have any more yan in the cider when we're going to bottle it. That's for the stability of the product. Be careful at this step. If there is too much population of Saccharomyces, when the fermentation is stopping, you will have a lot of sulfur compound generated in the cider, and in this case, you will have a reduction odor. Now, we have the cider fermented. We have a period of what we call maturation. I don't know if it's a good word in English, but before bottling, we can keep the cider in vat for a certain time, and during this maturation period, we can have different other microorganisms that can grow in the cider. So I put here a cider with aroma, fruity aroma that we made with the different yeast. And during the maturation, we can have lactic acid bacteria growth, Enococcus honi, and we call this fermentation malolactic fermentation. And during this malolactic fermentation, we can have a buttery flavor that can be made that change a little bit the aroma flavor of your product. But the problem is that it will increase the pH because you are going to remove the malic acid, and so it's fragilized the cider. It's more susceptible to other bacterial growth like the Lactobacillus collinoides or some other unwanted bacteria. Another kind of bacteria that can grow, I talked about it earlier. It's acetic acid bacteria. This bacteria is able to generate some acetic acid, like I said, and gives some vinegar aroma to the cider, and it will mask the other flavor. So it's not something you really want. And as well, you can have during this period some development of Brettanomyces anomala. So this yeast is not wanted in French cider because that's something we have demonstrated in an experiment. It's going to destroy the fruity aroma. That's one of these ability, if I can say like that. And then when the aroma is destroyed, it's going to generate some other aroma that you don't want. We call animals flavor. To show you what we have demonstrated that is that we took a cider with aroma, fruity aroma at mid fermentation, that the graphic on the top, and we conducted the endogenous fermentation on the left, and the aroma decreased. So probably there is something happened during this fermentation, and we wanted to understand what was happening. So in the middle, we have added some Brettanomyces anomala in the cider, and what we showed that after a moment, the aroma was completely destroyed. The esters disappeared. On the other side, we added some Saccharomyces yeast, so Saccharomyces uvarum, and on the other side, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, and we saw that in this situation, the aroma was even increased. That was the work that demonstrated the negative impact of Brettanomyces. So we have to be very careful about this yeast, and that's one of the things we try to avoid in French cider. The main problem with this yeast is that it's going to use the phenolic acid present in the cider. The recommendation we give is that you have to avoid the rotten fruits. So we have to have a good selection of the fruits, and you have to use a good enzymes with absence of cinnamoylesterase activity, because that's the activity that will release the precursor for the phenol volatile that Brettanomyces is gonna generate in the cider. So what is important at this level is really to be vigilant, to be looking at the lack of hygiene. So you have to be very, very careful about the cleaning procedure in your cidery. Equipment, but fruit as well. This yeast is even growing better when the temperature are higher, so it's more and more problematic with the climate changes. That's the reason why we recommend to our cider maker to work with low temperature, under 10 degrees Celsius. It's important to get rid of the oxygen, because this yeast is very sensitive to oxygen and will grow really faster with oxygens. Alors, I put nitrogen and sugar. Unfortunately, this yeast is very, very, how to say that, doesn't need a lot of nutrient to grow. So even in cider with low nutrient, with low sugar, low nitrogen, Brettanomyces will be able to grow. So that's the reason why all the other parameters I just listed are very important. The growth condition, I talk about temperature. This is a graph showing that the higher the temperature, the higher the speed of development of Brettanomyces. Usually we recommend to be under 8 degrees C to be, to protect the cider against the development of Brettanomyces. The technological means you will have to prevent this development is to go through a filtration, a very fine filtration, like cross-flow microfiltration. Eventually, if you have a cross-flow microfiltration during the fermentation, because this yeast can grow even during the fermentation, you probably have to, in this case, it's very particular, but in this case, you will probably have to inoculate a new commercial yeast to finish the fermentation. But it's not very easy in this case to finish the fermentation if you stopped it. But I mean, if you want to go through the fermentation for a dry product, you will probably have to, unfortunately, add some yeast. So just to remind some important parameters, at the end of the alcoholic fermentation, like I said to you, Saccharomyces uvarum will liberate CO2. When the fermentation ending, there is no more protection against the oxygen intake. So you have to be careful here. And what is possible is to go through the inerting of the vat by different type of gas. And probably, well, in this case, we can add as well sulfite and ascorbic acid. One of the options as well is to pasteurize the product. I mean, if you see that there is a deviation, off flavor coming, if you want to stop it, you can have these possibilities to really pasteurize the product to stabilize and to keep it clean. Last step, bottling. Before bottling, we will have to clarify again the cider. So why do you have to clarify it? Well, first of all, you want to have a clear product. Sometimes it's better for the consumer to have a nice product, limpid product with no deposit. So you have to clarify again your product. And that's going to stabilize as well the product from a chemical point of view, but for a microbiological point of view as well. You want to get rid of the microorganisms you can still have in your cider. So how to do that? Settling, centrifugation, filtration, there is different options. You can have the fining as well. Usually we are using proteins like the gelatin, but there is some other options, other flocculants like bentonite, silica gels, and so on, even if the efficiency is not the same. After clarification, we're going to through the filtration step. There is different material you can use, either the filtration or Castelguer earth or microfiltration, cross-flow microfiltration, sorry. There is different way to do the bottling in France. The main procedure is to have a final brand. So usually it's a mix of different cider. We have to equilibrate the sensory, the savor. Then a fining, and then a carbonation before bottling. When the carbonation is made, either you pasteurizing, the main procedure for industrial cider, or the small-scale cidery can make carbonation and can have pasteurization or not. Both ways are used now in France. And another way, which is a little harder to make and to control, is to add yeast to make the carbonation in bottle. So we add yeast, we have a second fermentation in bottle, and that's it. So the process for, I will talk a little bit about the bottling with carbonation. So at this step, there is two different ways of doing. Either you have a flat product or a carbonated product already, and so you have two different kind of fillers. So atmospheric filler or isobarometric fillers. I won't go through that. It's not the purpose today. But at this level, what is very important for spontaneous fermentation is to avoid oxygen dissolution in the product, because you're gonna have some aroma impact of the oxygen in the bottle. And then we can have pasteurization, when I said. The second fermentation in bottle, the principle is to keep the CO2 generated in a closed bottle, but to keep as well the microorganisms. So you have to know the nitrogen quantity in your cider at the end to know the yeast, the quantity of yeast you're going to add in your cider. So there is different way of doing that. The method champenoise, clairette de Die, etc., etc. Why it's very important to be careful in the bottling? Yes, in the bottling is because Brettanomyces can grow as well in bottle. So that's something we show in some experiments, that the yeast can grow after 6 months, and you can see we can multiply by 100 to 1,000 the population in bottle, and in this case the aroma is gone. The efficiency of the cross-flow microfiltration for us it's more efficient to go through the cross-flow microfiltration, because like you see on the screen, the blue bar are the population at the beginning of the filtration. Then the others are through the filtration. So there is at the beginning of the filtration, when the first liters of cider are coming, then in the middle of the filtration, and at the end of the filtration. And like you can see, with Kessel-Gull microfiltration, which is on the left, there is still some bacteria left in the product. With cross-flow microfiltration, that I call MFT, there is no more. There is one case of there is some Brettanomyces still present, but in 4 cases there is no more Brettanomyces. So it's more efficient. So that's a process that we recommended. To conclude, where the compounds are coming from, the interesting compound or the off-flavor compound are coming. So you have fermentative compound in the French cider. Some are coming from the oxidative yeast. You can see the acetate esters that we really want to have in French cider. Some other are coming from the yeast Saccharomyces, like alcohols, like ethylic esters. They can be, alcohols are precursor for the acetate esters. Unfortunately, you can have negative flavor during the fermentation that you should avoid. That the CSV, that's a sulfur compound that you have to avoid in the cider, reduction odor. And the volatile flavor due to Brettanomyces yeast. So that's the part we try to avoid during the spontaneous fermentation. We have some other compound. We have some varietal compound that can be made in cider, in specific cider. The last one is a specific one. It's a cider which has those varietal thiols, those varietal compounds. They are specific. They give some fruity grapefruit aromas, citrus aromas. They are very, very interesting. We can have terpenes as well. That's something we just started to study. And there is some equilibrium interaction between the flavor compounds. It's very complex to study, but those varietal compounds can be liberated in the medium by some yeast. There is some specific yeast, no uvarum yeast, but Saccharomyces yeast, Saccharomyces cerevisiae yeast that can help to generate those compounds. To finish, what is important to remember, there is a particular point you have to be really vigilant with. The cleaning procedure, to be careful about the fruit, the quality of the fruit. You should be very careful of your cidery cleaning on the vats, the transfer pipe, all the different equipment you're using. You have to really clean at each time you're using it. You should be really careful about the blend you're doing, because if you have a contamination in one cider. If you make a blending with other vat or other cider, you will cross-contaminate all your cidery, all your products. So it's very important to be careful and to know how is your product. Negative impact on aroma, that's the bad fruit conservation, the microbial contamination, so you have to be careful about the temperature. What is positive usually is to avoid sulfite utilization, but there is still a risk to have some other bacteria that will develop in your product. So why to avoid sulfite? In French cider, that's for the yeast I talked about earlier, Enseniaspora, which have a very important impact on aroma. In French cider, like I said, we have a lot of polyphenols, and we have an enzyme we call PPO, polyphenol oxidase. And this system will put the cider rapidly in anoxy, so we don't have oxygen very rapidly in the cider. And that's a kind of protection for the cider. Then the low temperature, again, we have to be careful. The variety of the fruit and the maturity should look at that to see how you can manage your fermentation. So the kiving is normally something very interesting for the flavor. When you have a good kiving, that's usually because Enseniaspora valbensis was developed in the product. That means that the aroma will be very good. And you have to be careful about the bottling, because it's the last step. When the cider is in the bottle, you have no more action possible, so you really have to be careful to the quality of the product you have in the bottle. Last point, I added this slide just this morning because I had discussion with some people in the room. You should really know the yarn composition of your must, because that will help you to know the speed of the how can react your cider, your must, how fast will be the fermentation process. So that's something you really have to know. Which level I have, because you will also know if you need to add some nitrogen in your cider or not. So that's a particular point. You should know the acidity of the product. Or usually you have a lot of acidic apple. What I saw yesterday in the tasting room. But you have to know where you are, because it's important parameters for the bacterial development. You should follow your volumetric mass. So that's something simple to follow, but like that you can see the speed of your fermentation, and you can control a little bit more the action you can have if you want to have a biomass reduction and so on. In France, it's what we are doing. We are following the volumetric mass to see if we have to make some process to control the speed of fermentation, which is very important, and it's not made even in France. We are really working on that to push the people really to go through that, is to have a microbiology analysis on your must or your cider to know if you have Brettanomyces contamination at least, because that can give you some information how to conduct or to manage the different cider you will have in your cidery, not mixing a cider with contamination. If you have a beginning of contamination, you can decide to pasteurize, filtrate, and so on. So that gives you really information to how to control your cider. To determine the strategy you have to have on your cider. Thank you for your attention.
That was Hugues Guichard talking about the science behind spontaneous fermentation as presented at CiderCon 2023. If you would like to watch the audio synced with the PowerPoint slide from this presentation, do subscribe to the Cider Chat YouTube channel. It will be going live there in the coming weeks. Or you could become a patron of Cider Chat and get the early released video today. Just go to the Cider Chat Patreon page. That's spelled Patreon. And with that, I leave you here. This is Rio Wind Caller signing off for now. Looking forward to seeing you in Ciderville.
Drink it like this. There is a reason why we do it like this. There is a reason why we do it like this. There is a reason why we do it like this. There is a reason why we drink it like this. There's a reason why we do it like this.
Yeehaw!